Nice to see you all again this morning. I know you've been doing this for 2 weeks, but for me it all seems like it's going by quite quickly. I guess this is the third and final session that we'll be doing this together. I want to do the same thing we started off with last time, taking some questions for people if issues had come up between sort of the end of our time last time and this morning. A couple questions got emailed to me, though, so I thought I'd start maybe by responding to those. Will, where? There, OK, yeah. Will had actually emailed these to me 2 days ago, and I just haven't been checking email, so I'm a little slow to get back to some of these. But two interesting questions that really take us back to some of the issues we were talking about the first day, more sort of high policy, Cold War kinds of issues. And the first question, if I've got it right, is about Yalta, and particularly about some recent statements by President Bush about Yalta, and a kind of revisionist history, I guess, that Bush is trying to put forward about Yalta, which I think is an interesting question at a number of levels. I was curious, though, to start by saying, do you teach Yalta? Is that one of the kind of big issues that, and in a nutshell, what do you say about Yalta? Why do you teach it? What do you want students to carry away from thinking about Yalta in the course of sort of post-45 American diplomacy? Again, in a tiny little nutshell. So who was teaching Yalta? Yeah, so what do you say?
Basically, the idea is first get to know the players. And by that time, it's in the context of World War II, they know who Churchill is, they know who Stalin is, they know who Roosevelt is. And their possible motivations and what the world is going to look like after World War II is really the gist of it.
Yeah. Others, different dimensions of it, or is that basically where people go with it? Yeah.
What did Bush say? I missed this. Because I have my radio and my entire life set to screen him out. So
there's like a spam filter for Bush. Yeah. Well, let me backtrack a little bit to kind of answer the context I think that it comes out of. Yalta is this moment toward the end of the war. The great powers are together. They're talking about the way the world should work. It's a different kind of conversation than the conversation that will go on in San Francisco about the United Nations. It really is high power, great power politics, in part thinking about kind of spheres of influence after the war is over. What kind of stable cooperative partnership can emerge in less formal terms between particularly the United States and the Soviet Union after the war. One of the dimensions of the Yalta Accords, though, and one of the things that is high on the minds of policymakers at that moment is Eastern Europe and what the situation is going to be in Eastern Europe when the war comes to a close. At that moment, Soviet troops are on the ground, essentially, in much of Eastern Europe. So there is a de facto kind of Soviet control over that area. They're the occupying force, at least in Eastern Europe. And that constrains the hands of both the Americans and the British, right? They're there. They're physically there, and that gives them a certain sort of say and suzerainty over what's going on. The decision at Yalta essentially was to accept that Soviet presence and allow those Soviet occupation forces to manage some kind of transition in Eastern Europe. Now then, the issue is what kind of transition, what kind of states are going to emerge out of that. And as we know, what does emerge out of that are a series of satellite states, right, who are puppets in some ways. They're not entirely, but the Soviets would like to see it that way, as sort of puppets of the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of World War II, one of the issues that came up over and over and over again, mainly by Republicans, but also by an increasingly large Eastern European emigre population in the United States. And Chicago was one of the sort of flashpoints for this, given the sort of large Polish population in Chicago. But again, Eastern European enclaves coming into the United States in big waves of immigration from the late 19th century onwards. Very upset about what was the real result of Yalta, that essentially from their perception, Yalta slips under the Soviet yoke. And the argument that gets made is that Roosevelt let that happen. That Yalta was a moment, in fact, where things could have gone quite differently. Roosevelt could have challenged Stalin more on these issues so that a situation wasn't set up that allowed the Soviets essentially to run roughshod in the late 1940s. So again, a very strong conservative political reaction to this in the late 1940s, buttressed by a Eastern European community in the United States, very, very upset about these kinds of issues. Well, you know, over time, generationally, that tended to dissipate itself. I remember the 50th anniversary of the Yalta Accords. There were, as there always are with 50th anniversaries of anything, you know, big conferences about it. And it felt like those arguments were kind of on their last legs. There were some sort of people who had been active in that period who would come to these conferences, but very old, really, by that point, who would push the Roosevelt sold us down the river sort of thing. But it felt like it was really passing, in a sense. And I think the kind of dominant historical interpretation has been, you know, what really could Roosevelt have done at that moment, given the realities of power on the ground? One might have hoped for a different sort of outcome. Maybe, in retrospect, the idea that the Soviets could have been pushed more, yes, yes. But probably, given the realities of power, that was what was going to happen. That's a hard thing to hear if you're an American Pole who doesn't like the government that's sitting in Poland, right? But again, from a geopolitical stance, that was kind of it. And I think, by and large, diplomatic historians accepted that interpretive framework. What's odd about the president's claim suddenly is, what I was trying to say there was the Yalta moment had kind of passed. The passions about Yalta seemed to have kind of passed. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, George Bush is talking about Yalta and how essentially Yalta was a giveaway to the Soviets and that, you know, that was Roosevelt's fault. So it's this reprise, really, of a kind of late 40s traditional realist critique, in some ways, of, you know, what had gone wrong with American foreign policy. But that isn't all the president said, or at least that isn't all the president meant by saying what he said. There is a larger kind of revisionist view that's starting to circulate around that's a very, very partisan one. And that is that at every key moment in the Cold War, if there was a Democratic administration, we sold out more to the communists because those weak-kneed Democrats didn't know how to run foreign policy. And at every moment that there was a Republican administration, there was a sense of resolve, a sense of purpose, and that pushed the Cold War in our direction. So as this whole argument about Yalta gets spilled out, it's spilled out in a larger context. And that is that Roosevelt, Yalta, a good example of a Democratic president who doesn't know what he's doing when he's dealing with the Soviet Union. Truman loses China. Again, you know, huge political partisan battle in the late 40s, early 50s about that. That's come back too. Truman didn't know how to, you know, maintain American power in East Asia. Essentially, Lyndon Johnson loses Vietnam, doesn't know how to run a war against the Vietnamese, right? So that's problematic. And Jimmy Carter, then, you know, the ultimate weak-kneed president, comes back in this narrative too. And then the contrast is, look at Eisenhower. Look at Eisenhower holding the line in a relatively tough sort of way. Look at Nixon's sophistication in dealing with détente and the Soviets. And penultimately, the most important thing for all these people is look at Reagan, the man who ended the Cold War, right, in their point of view. So the Yalta thing is a part of a larger kind of revisionist story that's trying to be told. That's really, I think, at this point, a very partisan story, you know, about the ways in which these things work. But it's a kind of teachable moment in some ways, I think, if students, you know, heard that or got engaged by that in some form or another, because, you know, Yalta can seem kind of in the distant past, and so it lets you go back in time. But it also recalls a way of using the past to think about the present, I think, that's helpful as well. What indirectly all this does is also reprise a kind of McCarthyism. Because, again, these were the claims that were all being made in the McCarthy period, that it was the Democrats, it was the weakness of the Democrats that allowed, again, the Cold War to sort of spin out of control, not in the United States' favor. And the fall of China in 1949 was the, you know, the sort of penultimate thing that the McCarthyites pointed to. So, you know, there are all kinds of ways to see how the Bush administration, in some ways, reflects some of these earlier trends and currents about freedom of expression, about, you know, people's ability to speak out, about manipulating news, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me this also, you know, if you want to think about it in those McCarthyite terms, helps to frame what's going on as well. I want to come back to a version of this question a little bit later because a kind of Vietnam War revisionism has emerged roughly at the same time as this that tells a very different story, I think, than most mainstream scholars would tell about the war. And so again, that gap between kind of where scholars are at about this, pretty much, you know, not everybody, but pretty much, and where a kind of popular discourse is going is very different. And we can talk more about that when we get there. A second question, I'll deal with this one somewhat more briefly, but the question was, when is it that the Soviets come to realize the existence of NSC 68? Or in fact, when it's released more publicly in 1970, are they surprised by it? What are their reactions to it? By the time it's released in the 70s, there's little in that document that would come as a very big surprise to the Soviet Union. The basic nature of how the Americans were thinking about the Cold War and strategies and that sort of thing would have been relatively clear. So I don't think it would have raised alarm bells, except in a kind of rhetorical propaganda way. See, you know, we always knew it was that kind of thing. And you know, there is certainly American intelligence, Soviet intelligence over that whole period of time where people are trying to kind of figure out what each side is doing, sometimes more successfully than others. So I don't know that that document in particular would hold that kind of, if the Soviets had gotten it in 1950 or 1951, and there isn't really any evidence that the document made it to them in that period of time, it might have been a somewhat different story. On the other hand, bits and pieces of what the Americans want to do obviously is making its way to the Soviet Union through various intelligence sorts of things. But it did make me remember something that would be a kind of interesting way of thinking about the 46 to 50 period in terms of teaching for you all. And that is that in 1946, the Soviets write their own long telegram about the United States. And this is one of these documents that's emerged out of this, you know, opening up to some extent of Soviet archival material. It's a document called the Novikov Telegram, written by a guy named Novikov. It isn't nearly as long or elegant or detailed as the Kennan thing on the Soviet Union, but it is, again, the Soviets' effort to do almost the same thing that we were trying to do at that point in time. And just by total chance, your email arrived when a package arrived for me of a new book called Debating the Origins of the Cold War, which sets up a discussion of the kind of Kennan containment moment with American scholars and some documents, and then with Russian scholars, the Soviet telegram, and a kind of discussion of that, and also the text of it itself. So actually, it's a really kind of neat thing, because it's got both things going simultaneously, sort of in one kind of place. So I've got that up here if later people want to take a look at it, or if it's helpful to you. But I think, again, being able to bring that perspective in can be quite useful, even if for your purposes it's a sort of auxiliary perspective. It's quite fascinating to think that just at the same moment we're writing about them in particular kinds of ways. They're doing the same. Not surprising that they would be, but nonetheless, we actually have the document now and can get a sense about what was being said. It's a more moderate view, as the Kennan view was a more moderate view, and in fact, the author of the document eventually is sort of purged out because those views seem a little bit too mild as time goes by. So it doesn't hold there. There was one other question that came from, I can't remember now, but it was a question about other NSC documents that you had seen. And you know, they're just endless NSC 144, NSC 60/. I mean, there are tons of NSC documents, period, but there are a particular density of them, late 40s, early 50s, as these various strategies are being outlined in particular places in the world. So, you know, they're trying to sort out what to do in the Middle East, more particularly when you think about containment, what to do in East Asia, what to do in Southeast Asia. And so some of these may have been the things that people were seeing. I still think that for teaching purposes, NSC 68 is probably the place to go, because that sets, again, this big framework for what's going on. But I realized one of the things I should have said and didn't about it is that although it sets the parameters, and although it takes this very universalistic, apocalyptic approach to what the Cold War will be, and foregrounds a military solution to it, as opposed to, again, the kind of Kennan approach, that left open still what the strategies would be to implement that larger sensibility about the world. And so you do see considerable variation over the course of administrations about how to militarize the Cold War. What's the most effective way to militarize the Cold War to win American aims? The Truman administration, where NSC 68 is adopted, tends to think about it in conventional military terms. So thinking about how do you go from the demobilization of World War II to a rapid ramping up and building up of conventional military forces. By the time you get to the Eisenhower period, the Eisenhower people have a somewhat different take on that. And part of that is about fiscal austerity and different views about spending and the like. And so for the Eisenhower people, atomic weapons, they don't think the Truman people have thought out the kind of ways in which atomic weapons and the threat of their use could be an effective military means of getting what we wanted in the Cold War. It also is a cheaper way, as far as Eisenhower is concerned. It's cheaper, even though it's expensive to build a big nuclear arsenal, it's still less expensive than building a huge conventional standing army. And then there are all these kind of traditional uncomfortabilities about having a very large standing army in the United States. There's no real tradition for that. So in an odd way, even though the nuclear technology is new, the advocating for it lets you keep an armed forces that fits better in some ways in American sensibilities. So you have these notions of massive retaliation and first strike and second strike, but also a lot of it about bluffing, you know, that if you do this, we might use the bomb here. That's true in a number of kind of crisis situations that the Eisenhower administration deals with, particularly in East Asia in that period of time. Then you get to Kennedy, and the Kennedy people think that that's too heavy-handed an approach to effectively push American Cold War strategy, particularly as the Cold War increasingly is shifting into the periphery, or what's called the periphery in this period of time. So the Kennedy people are keen to think about something they call flexible response, and particularly trying to build small, kind of mobile military units that can think like the guerrillas. That's the way the Kennedy people talk about it. So thinking like the enemy, in this case, the sort of guerrilla enemy, and being able to respond, again, more supplely and flexibly to that. What's a nuclear threat going to do to the National Liberation Front in Vietnam? Well, you know, maybe it would do something. But if you're actually fighting an insurgency, figuring out specially trained forces, it's the Green Berets emerge out of this, as does some other special forces as well. And then a kind of hearts and minds sort of focus of national security policy, too. You know, thinking about economic development and that sort of thing to kind of pull people out of insurgencies and bring them along. So, you know, I don't want to take it all the way to Reagan, but just to say that the big vision of containment emerges in 1950, and I think that big vision holds relatively over a long period of time, but to also say how to implement all that and the thinking about that really does shift very dramatically, often from administration to administration to administration. So it was your question, actually. So I was glad you asked, because I realized leaving you with, oh, NSC 68 is it, there's a kind of automaton quality about it, right? Oh, people just sort of go and do that. But in fact, it's very complex how people are thinking strategically over that period of time. Now, any other questions about issues that we were dealing with last time? Things unclear or things that came up in your discussion with Dana in the afternoon that you wanted to sort of foreground or flag this morning?
I was interested in two things, but maybe this, because this came up yesterday with Dana, I'll bring up this part. The blending of foreign policy and domestic policy. I think that being something my students would be interested in. So.
Okay, so there's also this thing that I was saying, you know, before your session in the afternoon, where there's some big issues that people wanted to get to that we haven't really gotten to. So can we kind of flag that one as talking more about that later on? Or is there a particular question coming out?
I thought that's what you were asking.
I guess I kind of was asking both, to be truthful, yeah. Okay, so the domestic foreign intersection.
Maybe this would help. That we were talking about how the Soviets had brought up the issue of segregation in our school systems in the UN. And then for anybody to fight for desegregation, for a while, it was sort of going to be tagged that you'd be a communist. And then there was the cartoon in the readings from yesterday where the communist propaganda hand was open and the segregists were walking right into it because they were just feeding into that they were going to use that this is why America's bad.
Yeah.
Type thing.
Yeah.
So, but maybe that is for there. I guess I misunderstood your question.
Actually, let's talk a little bit about that now. Because there are just a couple general things that might be worth saying about that to maybe better frame it for people in thinking about how to teach it. What I think is really interesting about those kinds of moments that we were talking about yesterday is the kind of doubleness or tripleness sometimes, and maybe even quadrupleness of what's going on in those particular kinds of situations. And particularly with how race plays out in multiple ways in all of this. So on the one hand, you have the Soviets pushing the fact that America still is a Jim Crow nation in the post-war period, and finding that to be a propaganda. Their propaganda doesn't always work, but that one really has legs because, in fact, it's true, right? And so there's a whole, sort of world press that begins to hone in on that kind of thing, which is putting pressure on the United States. The Little Rock case is a good one to see how, in fact, it seems that can move the administration to do things that maybe they weren't inclined to do. So there's a way in which that sitting out there as an international issue pushes a domestic agenda, perhaps in directions you wouldn't think it might go otherwise. So that's one dimension of it. But with it can come other possibilities as well. And Carol Anderson's book, I think, speaks most directly to those kinds of issues. And that is that because the Soviets flagged some of these issues as issues, then the possibility of tarring people with a kind of McCarthyite brush is there. And segregation and desegregation is one flashpoint for that. But as Carol talks about, human rights becomes a real flashpoint for that, because the human rights discourse has expanded beyond simply political and civil rights, our kind of Bill of Rights sort of approach to it, to these economic and social rights. And various domestic actors were engaged in that kind of thing, including many African-American elites who are engaged in a variety of civil rights politics, embrace much of this. That is easier for the administrations and for conservatives to tar activists about, because economic and social rights do sound kind of socialist to people, right? They sound sort of statist to people. And that really is a discourse that gets completely submerged as a result of the kind of heating up of the Cold War and the McCarthyite moment. People just don't feel like, in general, they can go there because of all the baggage that's going to come. So even if they believe those things are true, the political valences of the moment aren't going to let them make those claims, because what they'll spend all their time is fighting off the fact, no, I'm not really a communist, and nobody's going to be talking about the issues that they want to talk about. And so this, as Carol says, this tactical choice gets made in the upper reaches of the NAACP. So, a second way that race then comes in to, frame what's going on in that particular moment. So, what I think is interesting about that intersection, again, is that there's no one single intersection, but that there are these sort of multiple possibilities and effects that emerge in particular moments. And we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of white, middle-class American sensibilities about race, kind of mid to late 1950s, that I think will further talk about, or further get at, how this is very sort of mixed up. It gets that people simultaneously can think they're racially progressive and be carrying with them a sort of deeply racist way of thinking about the world. And it can inhabit sort of the same mind, in a way, in this period. So there's a lot of sort of confusion, uncertainty, anxiety in all sectors of society about how the race question works, its significance, how it would play out both in domestic and foreign policy terms. Anything else? Okay. Now, just for me, in getting a sense about pacing things today, I did ask people, were there some things that we hadn't gotten to over the last couple of days that are important for your teaching you wish we had gotten to and that we could talk a little bit about? And if there are, I'd like to sort of get those kind of out on the table now so I can see how many there are and sort of, again, pace what I'm going to do for much of the morning. Were there some things that emerged to people that they wanted to, issues like that they wanted to raise? No, we're covering everything you ever wanted to know about American foreign policy. All right, well, I'll ask the question again, in an hour or so and be thinking again in the back of your mind if any of that emerges. I just had one other thing that I wanted to mention. And again, I think this kind of plays off the question about the intersection of foreign policy and what's going on domestically. And that was reflecting a little bit on your discussion of these pieces from the real ambassadors yesterday afternoon. And particularly when people were talking about the song The Real Ambassador, and you were talking a little bit about what you thought some of the lyrics meant or ways in which you might interpret some of the lyrics. And I was thinking more particularly of the first set of lyrics where the description was being given of what those State Department people were like, And it was really interesting to me that people tended to read that in a kind of gendered way, that they could imagine that they were talking about women rather than men in that sort of role. And people said it in different ways, but it sort of came out in several places. And the sobriety, I think, was one of the things that people were thinking about and sort of imagining a kind of, I don't know, Katharine Hepburn as an ambassador or something in that kind of moment. And I had never thought about that, really, as I had listened to that before, but it seemed to me that that was right, that you could go there with it. And then I was trying to think about why you'd think that. What was it about the way that piece was working that would bring you to that kind of moment? And I don't honestly know, because I can't get in the Brubeck's head exactly about how they chose to phrase that. But it did recall for me that within McCarthyism is also an effort to essentially cast American diplomats who were seen as disloyal as not just red, but as pink. So there's a purge in the State Department of people who are perceived as being communists, but there's also a purge, and often the two groups are, overlapping, of people who are perceived to be gay, although then gay is not the term that's being used to talk about these kinds of issues. And so there's a kind of feminization in people's minds during the Cold War, kind of what diplomats are about, And that feeds into, again, that the line between that kind of sort of sexualizing or genderizing diplomats and a kind of political discourse is really strong. Going back to this thing we were talking about with Bush earlier, in the Truman administration, you lost China, and the argument that the Republicans made was that it was the Dean Acheson school of cowardly communist appeasers that lost China. That was the soundbite that was going on. Embedded in the notion of those cowardly communist appeasers were that they were effeminate cowardly communist appeasers, right? So it's not just communism. It's also about how communism and sort of notions of sexuality come together. And so, kind of almost the Brubecks seem to be a kind of progressive voice in the ways in which the real ambassadors go. And what I was trying to figure out in my mind was, is there something still unconscious for them about what's happened in this period that lets them present a satirical view of what the ambassadors are like in that kind of frame, And how much then in a kind of progressive discourse still shows the refractions of a much less kind of progressive discourse about what's emerging in that period of time. I mean, two other things about that. Sobriety does not strike me as probably where one would go to think about diplomats in that particular period of time. Somebody mentioned the first day that Stalin would knock them back. They all knocked him back in those days. Churchill was going through a bottle a day. And you read memoirs of these guys in this period of time. Wiedemeyer, this general who's off to China to negotiate out with, as Wiedemeyer used to call him, Mr. Moo. Wiedemeyer didn't realize it was Mao, and so one can imagine there were some problematics there just in kind of getting that discussion going. But so Wiedemeyer publishes these memoirs, and every day there's the had a couple of old fashions, talk to my staff. You know what I mean? They're a liquored up group that's moving through the whole kind of thing. Now, what real meaning that has, I don't know. But sobriety, again, doesn't really connect. But what, again, and I don't want to make too much of, maybe the Brubecks weren't doing this at all. Maybe this is all just in my head. Maybe it was just because you guys were suggesting, going a certain way with this. But there are all kinds of, really powerful moments in the Cold War that have an amazing effect on individual people. And that's something, that I was trying to foreground a little bit last time. But this is an issue, too, where the effect on individual people was immense. You're cleaned out of the State Department because you're gay. That was the end of your career, and putting your career together in any other kind of form was not a very easy thing to do. And again, I had sort of, understood this in a kind of distant sort of, academic kind of way. People are writing more about these issues as they hadn't been in the past, and so one gets a better picture of it. But it came home to me in a very surprisingly personal way in the last couple of years. My dad, who's about 85 now, decided a couple years ago to come out of the closet, which was something of a surprise for my mom, but we kind of have been working that out. But he tells a story about how he went through Yale, which is where all the striped pants boys, went, Atchison included, and that he had assumed that he would have a career in the diplomatic corps coming out. And the reason he didn't, essentially, was that there were various rumors about his sexuality, and that made it impossible, essentially, for him to move into that. And so again, a very distant kind of thing that you don't think of as kind of coming back into a person's life. But it did come back into his life in really very powerful ways. And I suspect there are many, many stories like that one, we're only sort of beginning to recover in certain ways. So again, I don't think it's just a slogan to think about the global and the local, or the domestic and the foreign, or that, that intersection is about the lived experience of people's lives. Sometimes tragic, sometimes very positive, but it's there, And it's a way in, I think, with students that people have not thought about in the past. So, I'll leave that there. Three issues that I wanted to focus on with you today. One, to kind of finish up a discussion about racial liberalism, or try to finish up a discussion about racial liberalism, but thinking about that now in the context of the Vietnam War. And so here, really, to kind of shift the gaze less from directly African-American sensibilities, and here thinking about sort of American images and perceptions of Asia. Second, I want to talk a little bit about how one might get into thinking in more complex ways about the experiences of war, and use the Vietnam case as a way of doing that. And then finally, trying to come back to where we started, this September 11th moment, and to think a little bit about how that moment and the ways in which particularly it's emerged in policy terms, how in fact the Cold War is still quite useful, I think, in thinking about both the sort of potentialities and the kind of problematics of the moment that we face. So it's those three places that I want to go, essentially. But to begin with this discussion of racial liberalism, I gave you an essay by Seth Jacobs, a chapter from his book. It's a book that looks at American support for the Diem administration in Vietnam. As I think we sort of briefly, very, very briefly, talked about maybe yesterday or the first day, there's the war in Vietnam is a very long one that predates the 1960s, when people think most about American involvement. The French War from 1945 to, or excuse me, 1946 to 1954, the French leave, and immediately the Americans come to support a strong non-communist alternative, try to create one, really, in South Vietnam. It's Ngo Dinh Diem that the Americans choose as a kind of indigenous partner by which to do that. Not unlike Syngman Rhee, for instance, in South Korea. And linked in the sense that Diem is a Catholic in a society that's largely Buddhist, Similarly, people like Rhee and also Chiang Kai-shek in China, Christians as well, again, in predominantly non-Christian societies. But those figures seem to be ones that the Americans find easier to work with in the kind of post-war moment. And Seth's essay, I think, is a really nice, short thing to kind of give you a sense about where the discourse in sort of American white middle-brow culture was about Asia in the 1950s, what that kind of cultural lens was. And he explores that in a variety of different places, whether it's in film, whether it's in some fiction, The Quiet American, The Ugly American that we talked about last time, and also just more popular sort of novels, magazine pieces, and that kind of thing. So I think that's helpful, again, to sort of draw kind of background about where all this is coming from. My own work about Vietnam has focused on a little bit earlier period. My book kind of stops really around 1954, but it starts in the 1920s. And it's really an effort, again, to think about kind of the intersection of race, culture, and foreign policy making. And essentially trying to argue that, you know, the Americans do view the Vietnamese, as they view many Asian peoples and non-Western peoples, through a lens of racial inferiority. The Vietnamese just are not complex people as far as the American observers are concerned. They are primitive, they are backward, all those modernization theory kind of ideas that we were talking about. And, as I suggested last time, that the French hadn't done what they ought to have done, that good Americans would have done to make them more capable for government. And so the post-45 moment, and particularly in Vietnam, the post-1954 moment, where you got the French out of the picture and it's just the Americans now who can do it, very, very optimistic about what American tutelage in political, economic, social, and kind of cultural forms can bring to Vietnam. So this is our shot, in a sense, at doing what the French didn't do, but that we believe is possible, which is essentially to move the Vietnamese, like many peoples in the post-45 period, on this kind of modernization trajectory. Even in the 1960s, when what you think much more classically about is America being involved in Vietnam because of the Cold War, because of American credibility, for various domestic political reasons. But generally, race sort of falls out of a consideration by that point in time. And part of it is, I think, you know, people talk about just the momentum of it. The American involvement is so long-lasting that, you know, by the time you get to 65, how do you isolate a particular variable? There's so many things that have entered in that period of time that, again, sort of push the Americans almost. People find it hard to imagine another alternative almost by the time you get to 1965, given the general kind of Cold War containment mindset. But I'm struck even in this later period of time by the ways in which these issues emerge again. And to give you an example of this, 1965 is often seen as the key moment for American intervention in Vietnam. 1965 is when the air war gets going really in earnest, Operation Rolling Thunder, and the beginning of a series of very intensive, if graduated, bombing campaigns in southern Vietnam and northern Vietnam. 65 is also when the decision to commit an unlimited number of American ground troops in Vietnam gets made. Now, there are American military advisors in Vietnam as early as the French period, and an escalating series of American military advisors over the course of the Eisenhower and Kennedy period. And by the time you get to the Kennedy period, you know, you're rotating in 12,000 American military advisors a month. You know, what's the line between advisors and people actually sort of fighting in the field? And that line gets increasingly blurred. American military advisors flying South Vietnamese troops out for missions and that kind of thing. So it isn't to say that in 1965 suddenly the conflict is militarized. That too is a gradual emergence over time. But what happens in 1965, and I think why that gets pointed to so critically by people, is that again, an unlimited number of American ground troops really committed to fight in Vietnam, and no real parameters on where they could fight. Again, some earlier decisions had put the Marines there, but said the Marines could only be fighting in a sort of 50-mile radius of a base. That's all gone now, too. So by summer of 1965, the kind of unlimited ground war begins, and this big bombing campaign begins. And again, those tend to be the decisions at the high politics level that people focus on. And how do you understand that? People argue containment, they argue credibility, they argue domestic politics. There are a whole host of things that people argue. But I'm struck that at that same moment in spring of 1965, that Johnson is also talking a language that will sound more familiar from the kind of modernization stuff that we were talking about last time. Johnson gives a big speech in April of 1965 at Johns Hopkins University, a speech that sometimes has been referred to sort of tongue-in-cheek as LBJ's TVA on the Mekong speech. Tennessee Valley Authority, these dams and stuff that got constructed down in the South. And what Johnson does in that speech is he offers to the North Vietnamese essentially the miracle of American technology to make the war go away. You know, that essentially trading American money and American expertise to build a series of dams on the Mekong that, as Johnson envisions it, will do the same thing for Vietnam that the TVA did for the South. Now, some people would argue that the TVA didn't really do for the South what people wanted it to do, right? So the offer really wasn't as good as it seemed. But Johnson's self-perception was that kind of high modernist sort of building was the way you develop places. Johnson has a conversation before that speech is done with some of his advisors, with Bill Moyers and others. And he talks to them about why he's doing this. And he says that, again, you know, the Vietnamese are a kind of backward people who haven't been able to, you know, do much with themselves. But with American know-how, in fact, that could change. So that all seems familiar. But what's striking to me is there's an incredible level of confidence that Johnson expresses before he gives that speech. And he says to Moyers, you know, I'm going to promise Ho Chi Minh essentially the TVA on the Mekong, and old Ho, he can't turn me down. You know? So again, to come back to that sort of thing that we were talking about the first time about kind of personalizing people and misperceiving kind of who they were in an American context, you know, it's kind of like you were dealing with a sort of Southern Governors Association. You know, you'd come out there, you'd make your deal, that would shut them up, they'd support you politically, and that would be that. And really, a very, very high level of confidence in Johnson's part, and a feeling that maybe that kind of offer would not prevent the war. He was, at that point, certainly ready to go to war if that was necessary. But again, a sense that this kind of non-political military sort of thing continues to occupy the ways in which policymakers are thinking about the problem. And much of what goes on in Vietnam in this entire period is at the level of the village and the province. And you know, hearts and minds becomes the slogan. How do you win hearts and minds over? And that's all about a kind of modernization paradigm that emerges first in the 1950s, but a modernization paradigm that, as I said, has this sort of racialist dimension to it as well. So I think there's a way of taking some of the material that we were talking about last time and thinking about that, again, in the context of the Vietnam War, where more classically one thinks about it in terms of air wars and ground wars. Now, I want to use that as a final way to kind of problematize what it meant to be talking about race in America, at least in kind of white, again, middle brow and policy-making circles. And I want to do that through another musical. And again, I don't really want to give the impression, you know, like that's all Americans did in the 1950s was kind of move between one musical and another. But this one, I think, opens up a way of having a really interesting conversation about American self-perceptions of being racially progressive in this period of time, and at the same time also opens up ways of seeing the sort of delusion of American self-perceptions at that moment too. Now, this one, Not the King and I, this one's South Pacific, which when I mention this to people, people generally say, oh God, I saw that when I was a kid. It was like 3 hours long. I thought I was going to die. You know, it's not something that people remember, oh, how fun it was to see.
Putting anyone in this room, would you?
I've heard it from others, though, Dana. What probably as a kid or whenever you saw it, if you saw it, and I have to say I had never seen it until about a year ago, what you don't maybe think about is the central character, or one of the central characters in South Pacific is Vietnamese. Bloody Mary, who is this sort of Earth Mother type woman who, oversees the mystical island of Bali Hai. Her name, Bloody Mary, is because she was a Vietnamese communist leader in the 1930s. And she had been sent by the French into exile into the South Sea Islands. So the Bloody Mary business is sort of Red Mary, right? Now, this is not, the South Pacific people, I don't think, worried about the historical accuracy of all this particularly. But in fact, that was what the French did to a number of communist revolutionaries in the 1920s and 1930s. They essentially set them into exile. And the French had these islands out in the South Pacific that were part of their colonial territories, and you just kind of send them there. And I came to understand this in a very roundabout sort of way, but when I worked in Hanoi in the late 1980s, there was a guy who made pastries, really old man who made pastries. The only person in Hanoi who made really tasty pastries. Generally, Vietnamese pastries were kind of not so tasty. And I asked him one day, like, how did you come to, how come your cakes are so good, essentially was the question. And he explained to me that he had been in the Communist Party in the 1930s and had been involved in a very significant rebellion up in the north. And he and a number of others had been rounded up and sent to New Caledonia, which is one of these islands that's out in the Pacific, that was a kind of penal colony, really. But his job was to essentially be the patisserie chef for, the sort of officer's commissary. So he was taught by the French, essentially, how to make pastries that they would find tasty. And he had had no opportunity until the more recent period when Vietnam liberalized and opened up to kind of use this skill to essentially make money for his family. But he had become this celebrated figure. So people may have seen this film Indochine that was made some years ago. Catherine Deneuve, stepping through Indochina. And huge picture of Catherine Deneuve, black and white picture, in the back of this pastry shop. Catherine Deneuve sitting with him, at the table. And she had gone there every day because he was the only person who could make French pastries, right? So anyway. It made sense to me then why this woman, Bloody Mary, would be in the middle of the Pacific. In fact, that was right. There were a number of revolutionary leaders who were there. Her daughter, who also will figure into the story, as you'll see, somehow morphs into being an Annamite princess. Well, I'm not exactly sure how you can be a revolutionary leader and be the Annamite princess, but we'll leave that be. Annamite was the French designation for the Vietnamese. So Annamite reads essentially as Vietnamese. So embedded in this South Pacific then is a kind of odd sort of Vietnamese story too, and hence for me, the connection back into it. There are two numbers though that I think can help us get, again, at these sort of tensions and contradictions of racial liberalism in this period. And I want to play one of them, talk about that a little bit, and then play the second one and talk about that one a little bit. And I don't want to do too much to set up either, in a way, because I'd rather have you have a more sort of unmediated look at it and see where you want to go with it. But the first one is called You've Got to Be Taught to Hate. And it's a piece that, particularly in a kind of American studies literature on the post-45 period, gets talked about a lot as a key example of a kind of racial liberalism in the 1950s. The notion that you've got to be taught to hate, right? That there's not a kind of innate sense about this. So when people are making claims, trying to figure out what are popular attitudes toward these kinds of things, over and over and over again, that song pops up. Seth may talk about it in passing, actually, in that chapter that you've got, but others, really sort of push that a little bit. But let's just take a look at it quickly and then see what you want to do with it. So we just turn that on and
it's not born in you. It happens after you're born.
You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
You got the right idea, Debeck. Live on an island. Yes, sir. If I get out of this thing alive, I'm not going back there. I'm staying here. All I care about is right here.
Yes. So, when all you care about is here, this is a good place to be. When all you care about is taken away from you, there is no place.
Came so close to it. So close.
So you've got to be taught to hate. In the middle of the 1950s, what's a song doing in the middle of an otherwise not very serious musical? Titled "You've Got to Be Taught to Hate." And what's going on there? Why is he singing that song? What's the song about? Help me contextualize that.
Well, in the frame of the musical, he is struggling with the issue of whether or not he could marry this island girl. He knows that it would not be accepted back in the United States. Certainly his parents and peers would not accept him because they're viewed as inferior in many ways, racially inferior, and he would not be able to do that. And he's saying that, it's been drilled into me since I was a kid that this is, how I should feel, and he's struggled with that issue during the course of this movie. Mm-hmm. And eventually, in the song, decides that he's finally breaking away from the conformist view. He's breaking away from them telling him what to do, and he's made the decision that he's going to stay here and live with her.
Yeah. I mean, that does help to sort of fill in kind of where it's at in the sort of flow of South Pacific, which is really helpful, I think. Let's take it kind of up to a somewhat more abstract level about thinking about these issues about race. It's, it's a constructed story in South Pacific, it's not true. Why do filmmakers choose to include a song like this? What do you think they're hoping is going to happen beyond advancing the plot and all that kind of thing? Is there more to what they're trying to do here? And if there is, what might that be?
Maybe by putting out a song like that, this is a Roger Hammerstein.
Yeah, it's Roger.
Didn't they do Sound of Music too?
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm thinking that maybe as producers of these musicals, they're socially conscious because thinking about the Sound of Music. In both cases, they're dealing with issues of people being discriminated against. So So maybe this is a song that, you know, it's bold, it's saying, you know, you must learn to hate, but in actuality, maybe they're saying if you're taught to hate, you can also be taught not to. And, you know, it's just kind of putting out there for the public to make a choice, you know, that it's not something that you just automatically do, it's a learned behavior. Because I think some people don't really think about, you know, our attitudes in terms of race as something that is learned. You know, I just think about kids in my own, you know, personal upbringing who said hateful things, and they didn't learn it because when you're little, all playing in the same sandboxes or whatever, that had nothing to do with it. But a few years later, then they were taught certain things and said certain things. So, you know, when you're 6, 7, or 8, you're taught to hate. That, you know, seems kind of corny.
Does it surprise you at all that this is in a kind of 1950s circa cultural product, that kind of message is there, or not? And if it does surprise you, why? If it doesn't surprise you, why? Yeah.
It doesn't really surprise me because I'm thinking, my time could be off from thinking it's a time where overt racism is being constructed by the middle class as a function of breeding and education. And so it's sort of like, I think in a lot of families, there's this kind of one way that it's okay to sort of behave in public and things that you can say, you know, in the grocery store, how you be embarrassed depending on how your children behave or if they stare or something. I was in a small town in Michigan a couple weekends ago, and I was with another friend who's African American, and this little girl was just like staring at us. And they were so freaked out that she was staring at me. Little kids just stare at people, you know what I mean? Particularly they stare at people if they look, you know, slightly different than people they're used to. It's not like a really big, you know, thing, but their parents were like mortified and like, I told you not to stare, you know? And it's like, how people behave in public is one thing, but then there's another subtext, I think, for people's families and sort of how you educate kids about race and what's acceptable, where those boundaries are, who you can and can't date, and how you can do things.
But it's not surprising to you that that kind of thing is emerging in the 1950s in people's head?
No, because I think when people are seeing those images on television, they're having to say to themselves, is that me? You know, am I, okay, yeah, I'm completely wedded to the notion of white supremacy, and I'm not even gonna, I can even sing You Have to Be Taught to Be Hate and still be wedded to that, but am I the person who would spit at someone on a lunch counter? Am I the person who would hose someone down? And I'm not, and so this makes it like, okay, that's not really polite middle class behavior. That's those people, right? That's the people who aren't educated. They're just ignorant, and they're also, you know, it's a function of poor backwater breeding. But we're really, you know, we have, you know, we go about these things differently.
In a way, the stakes are even higher in this film than just the marriage to the Annamite princess. That's what the guy is going to marry Bloody Mary's daughter, and that's the complication that he's facing. But there's another character, Mitzi Gaynor. Nellie for Bush. Yeah. And she wants to marry Emile, the French guy, the plantation owner who's on the island. But Emile has mixed race children that she comes to discover, and then she can't handle it, right? You can't, you know, she can't be the mother to these children. And in the very end of the film, you know, the beauty of sort of the interracial moment is that she comes to see this is wrong and embraces these children. And so there's this larger message that isn't, in a way, just about what you say, but also that somehow one can shift a sensibility about what's okay in a familial kind of situation. Again, circa 1950s America. Yeah.
This is 1955 or so?
Roughly.
So, I mean, Hammerstein, is it Hammerstein the internationalist? So he's always putting his sort of political views into his musicals anyway, and then this is the context. I'm not sure if it's Brown versus Ford on the domestic front or the Cold War and the international front, but I think he's definitely, he knows he has a, what was labeled a middle brow audience that he probably could influence, so he's going for it. I mean, he's going to make his message, make his point.
Well, this is not the only moment in the 1950s where this kind of sensibility emerges, but it's one, you know, very concrete place where you can start to have a conversation about it. The movies, in fact, are full of this kind of thing in the 1950s. Another well-known film, Giant, with Rock Hudson. There's a very critical scene in that film where Hudson is in a diner in the middle of the Southwest someplace, with a Hispanic woman and child, and there's a kind of altercation with the kind of white people who are in this diner, and Hudson eventually has to punch them out, in a way to say that no, it's not okay to say these kind of things. It's a very similar moment in some ways to what's going on here. And again, these are two examples of a number of instances from this period of time. So I'm not trying to lift an anomaly out to give to you. Yeah.
It's been a while since I've seen this movie, and I'm wondering, are there any Asian male characters that figure in any significant way?
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of thinking about, sort of just bringing out another point that he makes in the reading about white portrayals of Asians as childlike and needing to be managed and all these kinds of things, and how also all these, and a lot of these relationships seem to be mediated through sexual relations, right? These women are either sort of someone to marry or someone to be your mistress, but those are the people who are discussed. The Vietnamese, colonization through sexual interaction, and then what happens to the Vietnamese men in this picture? Where are they?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
In terms of just colonial dynamics in general, I know that's something that a lot of people are written about.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a very, in this case, a very feminized notion about what that other society would be for the Yeah.
I just think, that in the end, what happens is that his name's John, isn't it? The character who sings that, I don't remember, the character who sings, she hasn't been carefully taught. He's killed, right? So that the possibility of miscegenation is actually foreclosed there, whereas Nellie Forbush is going to marry Emile, but he's just French, right? So she adopts his children, but the film actually refuses.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. It refuses to go that far. But on the other hand, she does, in this sort of adoption model, come to embrace those
She
children.
used to be the mother, though. Which is not as threatening.
That's right. That's right. Which I think is, it's all, again, this sort of, there are a number of reasons why I think this can be useful to kind of work through issues with students. But I think there is, to me, a very frustrating tendency as people talk about race in a historical sense to constantly want to compute a kind of progressivism to whites on these matters. So these clips sometimes get flagged as, see, there is a kind of progressivism here. You know what I mean? It's not what you're describing in the 20s and 30s. Attitudes change. The war, is partially responsible for that. People are approaching these kinds of things in different ways. So these kinds of texts become evidence to get at those kinds of changing sensibilities. But as some of the comments here, have threaded through, there are obviously limitations on how far that goes or what that means. And those, I think, are as important as interesting as this sort of search for, here's a moment where things keep getting better. And I'm struck so often, when one tries to raise the issue of race, and maybe it's particularly in foreign policy terms because that's supposed to be this closed-in, kind of white male world, and so those things don't affect it. How much a discussion, even when you try to put it there, always wants to show back to this kind of thing. Well, really, people were thinking about these issues in much more enlightened ways post-1945 than they were. Attitudes are changing, blah, blah, blah. They are. There is a kind of shift in the ways in which people are thinking about it. But as you were saying, it's never quite clear what that shift really means. Is it about what's polite at that particular moment? But does that mean underneath, in fact, those attitudes have shifted around? I think it's a very open question about whether that's the case. And if you go too quickly to this kind of interpretation of it, then it's also a way of silencing issues of race and their salience in a sort of larger period. And it seems completely impossible to me to disentangle racial issues from American foreign policy throughout the whole course of the post-45 period. So this kind of moment, one can talk about some sorts of things that are going on in terms of white thinking about race. But again, just as important, I think, to be thinking about what it doesn't tell you. Now, the second clip that I want to show people, I think is a really nice way of, and maybe a little heavy-handed way, in fact, of pushing that part of the argument, particularly with students. Now, how do you get back to the little menu that lets you, you know what I mean, Dana?
Is there not a button that says menu?
No.
Confuse the page.
You got this?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's that one.
What chapter, man? Is that right?
Yeah, chapter 3.
Aha. All right. Where's that? Thank you. All right. Okay. Now, so the argument that was coming around here is that, with Rogers and Hammerstein, or whoever is sort of representing this kind of way of thinking about race, that there is a progressive past in some ways the way these are shown. So, embedded then in the same musical, where they're talking about, you've got to be taught to hate, is a song called Happy Talk. Right? I don't know if people have seen Happy Talk. You'll see it in just a minute. You can sing along. You can do the hand gestures along with. But take a look at this, and then let's talk a little bit more about racial progressivism in 1950.
Talk about things you like to do. You got to have a dream. If you don't have a dream, how you gonna have a dream come true? Talk about the moon floating in the sky, looking like a lily on a lake. Talk about a bird learning how to fly, making all the music he can make. Happy talk, keep talking happy talk. Talk about things you like to do. You got to have a dream. If you don't have a dream, how you gonna have a dream come true? Talk about the star looking like a toy, peeking through the branches of a tree. Talk about the girl, talk about the boy, counting all the ripples on the sea. Happy talk, keep talking happy talk. Talk about things you like to do. You got to have a dream. If you don't have a dream, how you gonna have a dream come true? About the boy saying to the girl, golly baby, I'm a lucky cuss. Talk about the girl saying to the boy, you and me is lucky to be happy talk, keep talking happy talk. Talk about things you like to do. You got to have a dream. If you don't have a dream, how you gonna have a dream come true? If you don't talk happy and you never have a dream, then you'll never have a dream come true.
It's a good idea? You like?
All right. So what do you make of happy talk? Where do you start, you know, in a way? Which part exactly? Say musical, right? You know, this is the message of you've got to be taught to hate. This comes a couple of numbers before, I think, you know, in the order of things. What's this doing here?
I don't know, I might be out on a limb on it or something, but I think overall what it's saying is that people to a great extent are people and all have emotions, feelings, and love, and the need to express human needs to one another. But if in fact you have been taught to hate, that throws a wrench in that whole scenario, and it makes things very complicated, and it dismisses all of those things in terms of humans needing one another. And that in fact, if you've been taught to hate, then you're going to be thinking about what mom's going to say about this, what dad's, my friends, will this be acceptable? But if I'm to stay here or whatever, maybe it in fact can work.
So this becomes the sort of idyllic place outside of normal society where things can work the way they can't work back home. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think in the context of the musical, that is kind of the story that they want to tell. What does it suggest, though, to tell a story that it's only in this imaginary world, and particularly the way this imaginary world is constructed, that one can live out that sort of racially liberalized dream? What imaginary world is being constructed in Happy Talk? Who is, you know, how does Bloody Mary appear to you? How is she singing? What's the style in which she's singing? How is she communicating?
Were they kind of making fun of traditional attire, or what they consider traditional dance, with the whole hand signal thing and then her broken English at the end? So these are almost like children, you know, wanting to be in this idyllic place, and she's gonna get this great husband, but it's like almost making, maybe not intentionally, but making fun of, like, this is the way they would be singing with their hands, because that's what Southeast Asians do.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's fair to say, for instance, that the filmmakers might not have had a clue you know what I mean? Like, that the disjunctures that we might see, they would not have seen between the two.
I thought it was sign language.
I think there's a good chance that they do have a clue.
You think so?
Essentially, it's a product that you're trying to sell someone. How do you figure, with anything, that it's not natural to give up privilege. So how do you, if you figure out how to market the willingness to give up privilege to anyone, you package it in a particular way, right? And so in this, like, the ideal is that this, you know, the relationship with this other is that it's a feminized other, it's a silent other, it's a, you know, sexually, you know, sort of available and convenient, and I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. I mean, that would be the measure of progressivism in terms of race relations, which is still our litmus test. Like, what would you want your sister to date? But what would you do with your daughter married? Like, that's the ultimate. Where he's not racist because he dated a black girl. Oh, like, white men having sex with black women is like totally progressive. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, there's a long history. There's not, essentially, there's nothing, you know, progressive about that. It depends on the context in which that meeting takes place and how people negotiate those power dynamics. I mean, just the sexual act itself, I mean, that's just replicating any number of inequalities. So, I mean, you know, when you figure, she's not saying, you know, she's like the ideal, right? Because, I mean, you know, how much better. Exactly, right? Isn't that how you like? Personally, I don't know how you like.
Does she speak at all?
But, you know what I mean?
Tell us, Julie.
She doesn't have much, Joe. She says a little bit.
I haven't seen the film, but she doesn't say anything.
Looking at her, it's like,
says a little.
Whatever she's trying to say with his her hands, he's not really paying a whole lot of attention to.
You don't think the subtlety of the hair?
Maybe if I do it back, she'll like kiss me. It didn't take very long for you, and then you kiss her. It's just
Look at her hands. You're trying to have X-ray vision.
And I think just because somebody can't articulate that that's their vision or that's what they're trying to do doesn't mean that that's not influencing how they're creating that moment on the screen.
I do have one on more foreign policy. During the American occupation of Japan, they insisted on showing the movies where people would kiss because it was this idea of that romantic love and democracy were this intertwined thing. And I was wondering if that same thing was true for this film as well, that we're exporting this great idyllic thing where individuals get to fall in love and have their dreams fulfilled. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a tie into it.
Yeah, no, that may well be, although I have to say that, you know, when they do actually kiss, Bloody Mary gets this really kind of alarmed look on her face, like she better get moving with the Happy Talk song again so that you can, so, you know, it can happen briefly, but the notion that it has to happen underwater for it to be, you know, a more sustained sort of, I guess, you know, different people struck by different things as you see these, and I think that's one of the nice things about using the clips, right? Because you can go in very different ways with it. What I'm struck by is how, in a sense, Happy Talk represents almost every Orientalist construction of Asia, you know? I mean, they're all there, right? We could kind of do it slowly and pick them all out, but I think, you know, they're all there. And let me just insert another sort of little factoid about the making of the film that kind of pushes that even more. The woman who plays Bloody Mary is African American. She was in the stage production of South Pacific as well. She was Bloody Mary in the stage production. As it traveled around the country in the 1950s, there were issues in the South about producing it. There were issues about the subject matter, right, and the sort of, even if it was Asian interracial, still that, and also about her as a very, you know, central figure in it, and that she would be African American. And there were some cities in the South that would not allow it to be produced as it was touring around the country. So it has that resonance. But I think more interesting than that, in a way, because that's almost predictable, I think, given sort of time and place, is that in the stage production, she sang all her own songs. In the movie, the Hollywood people thought that she didn't sound Asian enough. Now, they weren't looking for indigenous authenticity there. They were looking for somebody who had the kind of sing-song, stereotypical sort of Chinese voice, right, that they wanted to. So she's dubbed in all of these numbers with someone else who has that voice that they believe, you know, is going to encapsulate. So again, this notion of just every possible Orientalist stereotype going at one time, very consciously, the way in which she's singing, in fact, has been structured by the producers to give that sort of thing. So, you know, again, for me, that kind of clip, I think, is helpful, again, together with the other one, to suggest that there is a complicated discourse going on about race in this particular moment, but that the salience, particularly of a kind of Orientalized portrayal of Asians, remains very, very powerful for Americans, even seemingly Americans who are producing a film that they think is progressive, right? It's that it's embedded in the same thing, I think, that's particularly interesting. And again, to suggest, for me, this larger point about the kind of salience of issues of race, whether it's in an African-American case, whether it's in an Asian case, whether it would be in an African case or a Middle Eastern case, as crucial as a kind of lens by thinking about how Americans are perceiving the world beyond, and eventually how Americans will be shaping policy to the world beyond as well. Before we take a quick break, somebody mentioned to me yesterday, maybe more explicitly talking a little bit about American studies approaches to these kinds of questions and historical approaches to these kinds of questions. Was that? You? No? That was you, Dana. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. The kind of scholarship where I think you'd read most about these kinds of films, you know, or these kinds of cultural texts more broadly, would probably be in American studies rather than American history. That's changing some. I think the line there is not quite as firm as it used to be. And Seth's piece is an example of that, Seth working in very much sort of historical framework and bringing that in. But you know, contrast Seth's way of approaching these things, which is a kind of bump, 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 bump sort of tour of the horizon, which has its uses for what he's trying to do in his book, as opposed to these kind of close readings of these sort of texts, i.e. the kinds of thing Melanie McAllister was trying to do with the Steve Martin thing, or the kinds of things that others have tried to do with The King and I. Christina Klein, American studies person, writes in real detail about how she thinks The King and I and modernization theory and sort of, again, middlebrow attitudes toward Asia and race in the 50s and 60s all come together in that moment. So, you know, I think that if you want to use these kinds of materials, if you think these kinds of materials will be helpful at raising some issues that you can't get to otherwise, you may find yourself turning to American studies people to get a kind of deeper and closer reading of how to do it. Now, you may not agree with that deeper and closer reading, and part of what I wanted to do by showing that Steve Martin thing toward the end was so that you had the Epic Encounters essay that Melanie had written using it, and you know, you could think a little bit, well, she's trying to use that, she makes an argument about it, but unless you've got it fresh in your mind, it's hard to say, well, does that argument go anywhere? Does it make sense? Does it not? We didn't have a chance to talk about that. I understand you did have more of a chance to talk about that in the afternoon. There might be ways that it's useful, ways that it's not useful. But again, it's that kind of analysis that you're going to find, I think, more in that American studies vein. Now, you know, you may not want to go in this direction at all, and then you don't have to worry about the American studies stuff. But I think if you do, and you're looking for a place to anchor it, again, back into how it might link into policy, you've almost got to be moving back and forth between both those literatures a little bit for that to happen. Again, more traditional diplomatic historians starting to think about those kinds of things. Seth, a good example, again, but the more sustained reading of it, I think, remains more on the American studies side. Does that help a little bit to place some of the, okay, all right. Let's take about a 10-minute break and then come back and talk about some of this Vietnam fiction.